Really.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the second live interactive sessions for this course, Ecology and Society. So please tune in and I will be happy to respond queries and comments. So as we go along with the interactive session, what I'll do is try to give a brief summary of what we have covered in the last 4 weeks. So in module 5, we have uh, deal with the theme called conceptions of natures and contested domains and boundaries of cultures. And in the 6th week, we had deal with paradigms in human environmental relations. And in the 7th week, we have engaged with nature environment and belief systems. And on the 8th week, we have delved into religion in an age of environmental crisis, which of course will be carried forward in the next module as well. So, in the conceptions of natures or contested domains and boundaries of cultures, what we have did was to look at the how nature was one of the central concerns of within the disciplines of anthropology, and as our focus is particularly with regards to the subdisciplines of anthropology, which is called ecological anthropology, and we have engaged with some of those ecological anthropologists. So now, as nature is the central concerns in this pursuit of this particular course, whether in the field of folk science and cultural ecology or in the study of myths and rituals which are linked to the environment and subsistence techniques. So in recent years, the very issue of ecology in the broadest sense of the term has tended to be relegated to the margin of anthropological discussions, and as postmodernism and culturalist perspective have dominated the center stage of theoretical developments in the social science generally. So what is required is to rethink, that is rethinking the nature society interfaces, which also means rethinking the discipline or the subdiscipline of ecological anthropology. So in particular, its notions of the relations between person and environment. So in this particular module, we also engage looking at symbolic ecology and social practice, how anthropologists have engaged into looking at nature-culture dichotomy, and which was inadequate or misleading tool to account the ways in which the people they studied were talking about and interacting with their physical environment. So symbolic anthropology has devoted its attention to elucidating the logic of native cosmologies, which do not appear to classify uh, their components in conformity with the issues or with the rules of domain specificity. So the conceptions of nature were nothing but ideologies, that is, distorted representations of those objective material forces. So, if you look at the works of Levi Strauss, he tended to downplay the dualisms of the nature culture oppositions, particularly in structuralism and ecology, wherein he advocated a remarkably naturalistic conception of the working of the mind as a filtering device, decoding sets of contrast already present in nature. So, moving on, the contested domains and boundaries of culture. How do we engage looking at this? Now, if you look at the human evolutionary ecology, which is currently one of the most rigorous areas of research in ecological anthropology, which employ the oppositions of continuity and discontinuity on the one hand, and on the other of dominations and protection. So, if you look at the works of Persons, wherein he tries to distinguish between three kinds of human environmental relations, that is, namely Orientalism, paternalism, and communalism, each of which would, in essence, represent a particular stance with respect to the environmental issues. So, in the case of both environmental Orientalism and paternalism, humans are masters of nature, and the former exploits the latter, and whereas the latter protects. So, communalism is different from both in that it involves the rejections of any radical distinctions between nature and society, and between science and practical knowledge. So, if you look at the choice which are being generally made by humans in a particular cultural groups. So, for example, taking the case of hunter-gatherers or foragers, which live in environments characterized by diverse and heterogeneously distributed resources. So, the forager can choose combinations which more or less effectively and efficiently procure subsistence. So the forager's choice make up of a strategy of adjustment to ecological conditions, an adaptive pattern resulting from evolutionary process and the constraint situations, that is time and change. So what are the paradigms in this human to environmental relations? That is Orientalism, paternalism, and communalism. So these three paradigms, which I have already outlined, the paradigm of communalism differs from both the other two, and it rejects the radical separations of nature and society, object and subject, emphasizing the notions of logic. While the ethical approaches to the environment and human environmental relations are highly interconnected. For instance, if you take the case of the medieval period in terms of the nature and society relations. So in medieval Europe, there was no radical separations of nature and society. So man, if you look at the works of Gurevik, he goes on to argue that in medieval times, man thought himself as an integral part of the world, and his interrelationship with nature was so intense and thorough that he could not look at it from without, and he was actually inside it. So it was more or less a very biocentric kind of position. So the medieval term individual originally meant indivisible, that which cannot be divided, like the unity of the Trinity. So environmental Orientalism and paternalism, that is the contrast between domination and protection with respect to the environment. So environmental Orientalism suggests negative reciprocity in human environmental relations, whereas paternalism implies balanced reciprocity presupposing human responsibility. So in both the cases, humans are the masters of nature. So the third paradigm, which is communalism, emerged by rejecting the radical separations of nature and society, object and subject, and the modernist assumption of othering, certainty and monologue, which add to the dimensions of continuity and discontinuity. So this paradigm suggests generalized reciprocity in human environmental relations, invoking the notions of contingency, participation, and dialogue. So, Orientalist exploitation, this particular paradigm not only establishes a fundamental break between nature and society, but it also suggests that people are masters of nature and were in some way in charge of the world. So as we engage with looking at the works of Tim in Gold, So what he says is that in this colonial regime, the world becomes a tabula rasa for the inscriptions of human history. So this very vocabulary of Orientalism is typically one of domestications, frontiers, and expansions of exploring, conquering, and exploiting the environment. So for the diverse purpose of production, consumption, sport, and discipline. So in paternalism, it involves privileging the scientific expertise and inversion in the relative power of experts and laypersons. So in the modern environmentalist view, humans have a particular responsibility to meet not only to other humans, but also to members of other species or entities, to, for example, to the fellow inhabitants of the animal kingdom and also the ecosystems of the globe. So the environmentalist movement tends to fetishize nature, thereby setting it apart from the world of humans. So humans, as it is argued, are acting on behalf of nature. So coming to again the communalism, this particular paradigm rejects the separations of nature and society and the notions of certainty and monologue, emphasizing state contingency and dialogue. So unlike paternalism, communalism suggests generalized reciprocity, that is an exchange often metaphorically represented in terms of intimate personal relations. So one of the urging need to develop an ecological theory that fully integrates human ecology and social theory by abandoning any radical distinctions between nature and society is often recognized nowadays. Now, moving on to what theme of nature, culture, magic, and science. So the relationship between people and their environment, particularly the often presumed universal conceptual dualism of nature and culture. So nature culture dualism forms part of the Western ethno-epistemology and derives from a non-universal ontological basis. So the concepts such as basic and science are investigated with particular reference to their dualist usage in anthropological discourse and to wider philosophical debates. So, what are the presumed dualism of nature and culture? So, if you look at the works of Wagner, which they go on to argue that although we allow that other cultures comprise sets of artifacts and images uh, which differ in style from our own, we tend to superimpose them on the same reality that is nature as we perceive it. So therefore, there is no such things as nature or culture. So it is a highly relativized concept whose ultimate significance must be derived from its place within a specific metaphysics. So, for example, the works of anthropologists like Evans Pritchard, wherein they talk about the witchcraft, magics, and oracles. He goes on to argue that our body of scientific knowledge and logic are the sole arbiters of what are mystical common sense and scientific notions. What he also called it as a context independent reality. So even Pritchard goes on to argue that judged by the criteria of this Western science, witchcraft does not really exist. So despite the observed and recorded fact that, for example, the gender communities' notions about witches and their doings display a consistent logic all on their own. So studies of indigenous ecological knowledge often emphasize that taxonomic categories and criteria for classifications do not correspond to those of Western science and that of the indigenous perceptions of ecological linkages and are not consistent with Western postulates on causality. Now, coming to the final the theme which we have dealt in the last few weeks, the role of religion in the environmental crisis, and it is important in this backdrop to look at the relationship between religion, nature, and uh, environment. So herein we engage upon the works of Roy Rappaport. So Roy Rappaport argues in his works that religion is central to the continuing evolution of life, although it has been displaced from its original positions of intellectual authority by the rise of modern science. So his seminal work, the book, which is called Ritual in Religion in the Making of Humanity, he sort of constitute uh, in some degree religious as well as about religion, and insists that religion can and must be reconciled with science. So combining adaptive and cognitive approach to the study of humankind, he mounts a comprehensive analysis of religion's evolutionary significance, seeing it as a coexistence with the inventions of language and hands of culture as we know and perceive it. So at the same time, he also assembles the fullest study that is yet of religion's means component, rituals, which constructs the conceptions and which we take it to be religious and has been central in the making of humanity's adaptation with their environment. So, to review the anthropological evidence which might allow to a more comprehensive understanding of ritual as the practical metrics of religious life. So, again, to construct a religious compatible with the scientific laws and ruling the world for which humanity is ultimately responsible as that part of life on this planet which is able to think. So religion, in etymologically speaking, bind us to an external force, and it stabilizes our meaningful interaction with the world and provides an anchor for our volatility. So we have also, engaged upon some of the works of socialists, particularly Immanuel Kant, and his works in his the elementary forms of religious life, wherein Durkheim attempts to demonstrate that science springs from the same desire, that is to connect the known and unknown, that spawned religion. So Durkheim believed that the central task of rituals was to instill this collective representation in each of us. So in the state of spiritual ecstasy, we internalize relations which bind us to each other in social life. So he did not really elaborate on these rather important conceptions of the socialization process. Roy Rappaport, on the other hand, gives a very much rigorous and explicit attention to ritual because he finds it in the ground where religion is made. So he also uses and goes on to explain about adaptations and the process through which the living systems of all sorts or organisms or population societies, possibly ecosystems or even the biosphere, maintain themselves in the face of perturbations, continuously threatening them with disruptions, death, or extinction. So adaptive responses to the perturbations include both the short-term and reversible changes to state and long-term irreversible changes in structures. So ritual regulations in terms of the environmental relations are best explained by taking the case of the Sembaga community and to the Sembaga notions of understanding or their worldview. An ecosystem is a system of material exchanges and they maintained against other human groups exclusive access to the resources within their territorial borders. So, in the upcoming classes, we will be dealing with more on the that is the role of religion in environmental crisis, and also engage upon some of the environmental ethics. Uh, I look forward to interact with you all again, and please try to, pose questions if you have any, and then I'll try to clarify the certain doubts and uh, look forward to interact with you also. Thank you.